Lakuta Sichis, Chelek Yudaled, the Sicha of Reeh Aleph. This is a Rashi Sicha, a Geschmack Rashi Sicha, that incorporates a few other inyanim in order to strengthen the understanding of the players, of the individuals, the Manda Omars, who say the specific Pirushim about Rashi, and also a very beautiful Hira'ah, a lesson in the Yena Shal Torah in the Chassidus perspective of this pasuk. Ala pasuk rak chazak lebilti yachel hadam ki hadam wa nefesh. The pasuk says, just be strong to make sure to not eat the blood, because the blood is the soul, or the life source. Rashi quotes the beginning of the pasuk, rak chazak lebilti yachel hadam, just be strong to not eat the blood. Umefarash, and he explains, mimashe nemar chazak, from the fact that it says the word chazak, be strong, you learn, they were immersed or steeped in eating of blood. Therefore, that say chazak, be strong, it was something that they were it was common, something that they did a lot, and therefore I had to say, be strong to not do it. This is the approach of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon ben Azai says, this is the famous Tana, sometimes known as Ben Azai, sometimes known as Shimon ben Azai, and sometimes known as Rabbi Shimon ben Azai. He says, Leba akasu elalaz hircha ulelamdecha ad kama atatzorech liyischazek b'mitzvahs. The word chazak here is not relevant to the blood, the mitzvah of not eating blood. It's actually coming to teach you a more general lesson, how strong you have to be when it comes to mitzvahs. When you're talking about blood, which is easy to be careful, to keep this mitzvah. And Rashi explains why. Because a person does not have a natural desire, a natural taiva to blood. Nevertheless, the Torah is mechazik you, it strengthens you by telling you, by prohibiting you from eating it. So this is how much more so when it comes to other mitzvahs, that we do have an appetite or a desire to do what we shouldn't do, or to not do what we should do. We should strengthen ourselves, rak chazak, to keep the mitzvah properly. The pashtus moving akushi shebekasov shirashi nachas lataritz. Simply, it's understood the difficulty that Rashi is coming to answer. Fumashan amar chazak. The fact that the pasuk says the word chazak, we don't find this terminology, this term chazak, in other mitzvahs of the Torah. And you wonder why? Why over here, punkt, does it say rak chazak levilti yachel adam? Maybe adrasha shebesifri kan. Therefore, Rashi brings these drashas from the Sifri, shalpi and mevur lashon chazak and bedam. That based on them, it is explained the word chazak, that it's said by blood, either that we're talking specifically about blood, and the Yidden were were steeped into eating blood, and therefore they needed an extra chizuk to be pulled out of this habit of eating blood, or that blood is not even an issue really, but since it mentions something that is such an easy mitzvah, the Torah says chazak to tell us that by all mitzvahs we should learn from this one to be careful and be mechazik ourselves, strengthen ourselves to do the right thing. If this is the sole answer, the question that Rashi is coming to answer, this will raise 5 questions. Aleph. Duber kam palm shekash Rashi may be based pirushim ulafish vekolachot mea pirushim yeshnei kushi bavana saksuvim. Sheyuturis al de pirush hasheni. Ela shapirush harishon karav yesh lepshut shel mikra. It has been discussed many times, even within the short period of time that we have been learning together. We've brought this up many times, that if Rashi brings 2 pirushim, it's because each of the pirushim, each of the explanations that Rashi brings has a difficulty or a question or a hardship that the other one answers. But the first one is the one that is more consistent with Pshutei Shel Mikra, the simple understanding, the basic understanding of the pasuk, and therefore it comes first. But it is lacking something, and therefore we need the other pirush. And based on this approach, we have to be explained. And for what reason Does Rashi have to bring here both drushes? That the Rabbi Yehuda, that the Yidden were steeped in blood, and that the Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, that the Yidden were not steeped in blood. This is actually an easy mitzvah, but it's teaching us to strengthen ourselves with regards to other mitzvahs. Why do we need both? What is the question in the first pirush, in the first explanation, that is answered by the second explanation? And what is lacking in the second pirush, which compels Rashi to bring the first pirush? That's our first question. Why do we need two pshatim in Rashi? Base. Second question. In general, in this machlokes, so there's not so much on Rashi for bringing both, but in general, if you go back to the machlokes of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, especially if you're looking at it from the angle of pshat, of simple understanding of the pasuk, there's a question here. This is a disagreement in reality. It's a disagreement in matters of fact. And on two opposite extremes. The Rabbi Yehuda, he is compelled, it's necessary to say chazak, because they were steeped in blood, in the eating of blood. That at that time it was common and extremely common to eat blood. Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, on the other hand, says we don't even need any form of strengthening when it comes to the eating of blood, because it's easy to be careful from not eating blood. A person doesn't have a natural desire for it. And that was true at the time of this commandment, which is why it says and we learn from there to other mitzvahs. So Rabbi Yehuda is saying that not only they ate blood from time to time, but they ate it all the time. It was something that they were immersed into, the eating of blood. And Rabbi Shimon ben Azai is saying that it was something that, when it comes to blood, no one has a tire for it. It only says chazak because it's talking about other mitzvahs. So which one is it? Were the Yidden at that time steeped into eating blood, or were they hardly doing it at all, or not doing it at all, because it's an easy mitzvah and there's no desire for it? Question 3. When you focus on the words of Shimon ben Azai, Rashi explains why is the mitzvah of not eating blood kal hishamer. Rashi explains she'ein adam is avale, because a person does not desire it, does not have an appetite for it. The loy she'ein adam shatuf boy, but Rashi doesn't use the words that a person is not immersed in it. If Reb Shimon ben Azai is coming to negate the approach of Rabbi Yehuda, then he should have used the same terminology. Rabbi Yehuda says that the Yidden were shtufim b'dam, and he should have said ein adam shatuf b'dam. People are not shatuf, not immersed in the eating of blood. Nevertheless, he chooses a totally different terminology, saying that a person doesn't have an appetite for it or doesn't have a desire for it. So why does Rashi choose those words? It's important to point out that the word she'ein adam misavaloi is not in the Sifri. It's going to it's going to mention in the next ois that the word she'ein adam misavaloi is not in the Sifri. It is something that Rashi adds to explain what does it mean that the mitzvah of dam is a mitzvah that is kal lehishamer mimenu. But the question is, if these are Rashi's words, why not use the terminology that he previously used, shtufim b'dam, and instead he introduces a new term, ein adamis aveloi. Question Dalid, similar to this question on the choice of words, ein adamis aveloi. We have another question. The Kamar ala pasuk two psukim later, it says leman yitav lach v'gemer, that if you are careful on this mitzvah, the Eibishter will reward you. Pirush Rashi teaches say ulamad matan tzardan shal mitzvahs. We could learn from here the rewards for mitzvahs. Im hadam shenafsh shel adam katsa mimenu, if blood, which a person is disgusted by it, nevertheless the Torah is giving you such a beautiful reward leman yitav lach, and for sure by other mitzvahs. that are more difficult to fulfill, because a person wants to do them, means they wants to do the Aveda or doesn't want to do the mitzvah, for sure there's a big schar waiting for you. From this lashon, it's mashma that this is not something that was unique to that time, but this is a general thing. Dam, blood, nafshe, shalodim katza, mimenu. A person is disgusted by it. This doesn't follow not Rabbi Yehuda, not Rabbi Shimon. The Rabbi Yehuda, yushtufim b'dam. According to Rabbi Yehuda, they were immersed in the eating of blood. Heipech nafshei chulu katzim mimenu, which is the opposite of a person being disgusted by it. Even according to Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, that a person doesn't have an appetite for it. But it doesn't mean that people are disgusted by it. There's many things that I may not be interested right now, but it doesn't mean it revolts me. And according to this second Rashi, a person is revolted by dam. So which one is it? Question, hey. Rashi maybe shame balamaim and imleish al yedei zanesav beer b'teichen apirush al kolpanim l'tal mimulach. It's explained many times that Rashi does not bring the name of the person who said the teaching unless the name is relevant to understanding the explanation. Sometimes only to the seasoned student, but at least it adds to the understanding of the Pirush. What is added to the Pirush by knowing that the ones who said it were Rabbi Yehuda and Shimon ben Azai. Additionally, this same Pirush of Rabbi Shimon ben Azai is brought in the Sifri also in the name of Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Rashi should have said, our sages explained, referring to both Rabbi Shimon ben Azai and Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel would have been included in this. And yet he totally ignores Rabbi Gamliel, so to speak, and he said, Dafka, the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, implying that Rabbi Shimon ben Azai's name is important here. And the question is, why is that? In Ois Beis, before we get to the biur, the explanation of Rashi, he's going to bring three differences between Rashi and the Sifri. The Sifri is the Makar, is the source of Rashi, yet Rashi changes in three places from the Sifri, and we're going to ask why. Why does Rashi change? What is the significance in these differences that Rashi makes from the Sifri? As we said earlier, the Pirush of Rashi is from the Sifri. Rashi changes from the Sifri. In certain places, he skips something that the Sifri says. And in other places, he adds on to what the Sifri is saying. And let's look at these three things. Aleph, number one. The Sifri says, in the words of Rabbi Yehuda, "Shahayu shtufim bedam kaidem matan Torah." Emphasizes the words kaidem matan Torah. That Rabbi Yehuda was saying that the Yidden were immersed in blood before matan Torah. Rashi maitik rak shtufim bedam. Rashi quotes the fact that they were immersed in blood and skips this detail that it was before matan Torah. Now this hashmata, this fact that he skips these words, is actually opposite of what the Sifri is saying. This pasuk is being said 39 years after Matan Torah. And Rashi is saying that you have to tell the listeners, chazak, be strong, because they are immersed in blood now. Ain't pluktas Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Shimon ben Azai b'Metzias. If Rashi had quoted the Sifri properly, and therefore said that the fact that the Yidden were shtufim b'dam, were immersed in blood, was something that happened before Matan Torah, then this would help resolve the machlokes, in fact, the dispute in matters of fact between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon ben Azai. Because you could answer that Rabbi Shimon ben Azai agrees that before Matan Torah they were immersed in blood. And the fact that now the Yidden do not have a taiva to blood is because it's already 39 years later, and in the interim they were told a mitzvah of not eating blood, and therefore they stopped eating blood. So number one, why Bechlal does Rashi change the Sifri's approach that the Yidden were Shtufim B'dam before Matan Torah and imply that the Yidden were Shtufim B'dam after Matan Torah? Especially since if he had said that this was only before Matan Torah, this would have resolved this disagreement in reality between him and Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon ben Azai. So we have to understand why Rashi does not include the words Kaidem Matan Torah, that the Yidden were Shtufim B'dam, immersed in blood before Matan Torah. Base. Second difference. Rashi Mayrich B'divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rashi elaborates in a long-winded expression. Mimash and Nemar Chazak. From the fact that it says the word chazak, you learn that the Yidden were Shtufim B'dam. And then he says again, therefore it had to say chazak. Sifri, it's much more concise. This teaches us that they were immersed in blood. And Rashi says, this teaches, from the fact that it says chazak, you learn that they were Shtufim B'dam. And therefore it has to say chazak. This is long-winded and different than the Sifri, which is much more concise. Gimel, the third difference. Sifri is to be Rabbi Shimon ben Azai. Madam she'ein b'chol mitzvahs kal mimenu, just like blood, that there's no easier mitzvah than it. His hircha akas of Allah, the pasuk still warns you about it. Rashi explains and adds, why is it kal mimenu she'ein on the masavalik? Because a person does not have a desire for it. So these words are added onto the Sifri. And the question is why? Even though for some of these differences, you could answer that Rashi had a different version of the Sifri. You know, in the times of Rashi, when the Sifri was being passed down, with all Sfarim were being passed down by handwritten copies, or even if it was, I guess, mostly by handwritten copies. So some of the nuschois, some of the girsais changed. The copy editor, or the copywriter, rather, the person who's writing down the copy, could make a mistake. So maybe Rashi had a different girsa. That in itself would demand an explanation. Why does Rashi choose a rare version of the Sifri instead of choosing the more common version which we have? The fact that all of the common day prints of today's Sifri have this version, this would imply that most of the handwritten manuscripts of Sifri followed this version, which is why when they printed it they used this version. Gam Bismanashi, which this would be even the time of Rashi. So the question is, even if you're going to tell me that Rashi wasn't making up his own version, he was following a different version of the Sifri, why does Rashi choose this rare version of the Sifri instead of choosing the more common version, which is the one that we have today? Obviously, if he does so, it's because there's something specific that's being learned or understood in the pshat of the pasuk based on this version of the Sifri. And this brings us to Eis Gimel, which is going to give us the beer, the explanation in Rashi. And we're going to start with this fact that Rashi doesn't say the words Kaidem Matan Torah. Rashi does not repeat the words Kaidem Matan Torah from the Sifri. The explanation is as follows. Rashi Yeni Maitik B'divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rashi does not follow the version of the Sifri that we have, that the Yidden were immersed in blood before Matan Torah, the Mashma Usa, because that would imply Shenishtana Lachar Matan Torah, that it changed after Matan Torah. That after Matan Torah, the Yidden were not anymore Shtufim B'dam. Ki al pi zeh, move on, because if you follow this approach, we would have a question. The prohibition against eating blood is said in the Torah numerous times. This is a very important parenthesis. The Rebbe understands that when it says that the Yidden in the Sifri, that the Yidden were immersed in blood before Matan Torah, this is referring primarily to Mitzrayim. That since in Mitzrayim they were shtufim bedam, that the Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, were immersed in eating blood, and the Yidden spent a significant amount of time in Mitzrayim, they adapted this tendency of eating blood. So it originates in Mitzrayim, where they were shtufim bedam, and it's carried with them into the Midbar. But if you're going to say that it only happened before Matan Torah, that the Yidden it started out in Mitzrayim and it only went until Matan Torah, then it should have said chazak when they were given this prohibition the first time around. We're close to the time right after Matan Torah, which is much closer to the time period when they were actually shtufim b'dam. Why were the Yidden commanded now to strengthen themselves with regards to eating blood, now in Chumash Dvarim, which is being said at the end of the 40 years of the Yidden being in the Midbar, and that day that was in Mitzrayim already died. And it doesn't say chazak when it comes to the eating of blood, to the prohibition against eating blood in Vayikra, which is much closer to the time of the giving of the Torah, and much closer to the time that the Yidden actually were shtufim b'dam. If you follow the Sifri, it comes out that the Yidden hadn't been eating blood already for 38 years, 39 years. All of a sudden, now it says chazak. Rashi elaborates. We asked one of our questions, why is Rashi elaborating? He says, it's the fact that it says over here in Chumash Dvarim, 39 years later it says chazak. This teaches us that they were still immersed in eating blood. Now when this is being said to them, even 40 years later, in the 40th year, when this commandment has been given to the Yidden were still shtufim b'dam, and therefore the Torah has to say chazak. Now, we said that this, if he would have said Koydem Matan Torah, would have answered the machlokes, would have resolved the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Now, if you're telling me that the Yidden are still shtufim b'dam, so now we have a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. In reality, are they shtufim b'dam or are they not shtufim b'dam? So he's going to say over here that it's resolvable. It's not necessarily a machlokes b'mitzias. So we call makam ein b'zeh machlokes b'mitzias. V'leimer shesfaras Rabbi Yehuda afucha misfaras Rabbi Shimon ben Azai sha'adam ein adam is'av eloi. It's not necessarily machlokes in fact, in reality, that Rabbi Yehuda is saying something that's the exact opposite of Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, who says that a person does not have a tie with the blood. It's possible for a person to not have a desire to something. Even more so, it's possible for a person to be revolted by something, and nevertheless be immersed or steeped in eating it for a side reason, for a different reason. Either mamin she is sgula, he believes that there's some sgula in it, there's some omen in eating it, or refuah, or there's a medical remedy by eating this bazeh. By eating it commonly, you see people eat medication or certain healthy foods that they don't enjoy or they don't like it, and they eat it because they believe that it's good for them. So it's possible, so the same thing could be applied in the case of the eating of the blood. They were still immersed in it for many years after leaving Mitzrayim, even if they did not have an appetite for it, or even possible that they were reviled by it. And yet they ate it because there was a different reason. Either they got used to it, or they thought there was some a health value to it. Whatever it is, it could be there was something that there was shatuf b'dam, and at the same time, so it's not necessarily a machlekes in fact. Both facts could be true. Number one, it's true that a person doesn't have a taiva to it. Number two, there was shtufim b'dam, and it's not a machlekes b'metzias. And this explains why Rashi brings the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that there was shtufim b'dam, because this explains why the Torah is chazak, because even though it's 40 years later, nevertheless the Yidden are still eating blood. Omnom ein dai b'tam zel ma shenemar dafke kan chazak b'dam. This is still an insufficient reason for saying the word chazak. In other words, even though we understand that the Yidden were still eating dam now, but still, why does it have to say chazak? The whole reason Rashi is coming to explain why it says chazak, it's still not explained. For three reasons. Aleph, kivon shel yishtufim b'dam, hava le'lememer chazak, gam bo'azor al dam shebesefer vayikra. If the Yidden were shtufim b'dam 40 years later, then for sure they were shtufim b'dam 30 right after that Matan Torah. In Chumash Vayikra, when the Yidden are told for the first time not to eat blood, or the main time. Its main, most important place should have been there. Right away, when the Yidden are introduced to the prohibition against eating blood, the Torah should have said, Chazak, even though you're shtufim b'dam, be strong and don't eat it. In the 19th star, he says it's not a major question, because there are many mitzvahs that were introduced later on, even though they were applicable earlier. But nevertheless, it's still that's the 119. But I guess from the fact that he brings the question, is he feels, and even though there are many mitzvahs that were introduced later on, but if you're going to say chazak on something, it's going to be then there's something that needs a chizuk. Then it always needed a chizuk. So why wasn't it mentioned earlier? Beis v'ikir. A more important question. Mikivon shekvar huzeru kama pal malachidas dam lefnei shnas arbaim ein mistabra klal loimar shebmeshach korav l'arbaim shana lo heilu kol azaris elu klal v'adayinu yishtufim b'dam. The Yidden were already told numerous times by Moshe Rabbeinu in the name of Hashem the prohibition against eating blood. So it's not logical to say that still the Yidden were still so ignorant of this halacha to the point that they were shtufim b'dam, that they were still immersed in eating blood. I mean, how could it be after so many times of being told not to eat blood, the Yidden would still be shtufim b'dam? If they were still eating it, maybe it took time for people to wean themselves off. But to say that they're still shtufim b'dam after being told a few times that it's usher is hard to say. And it's even more difficult. That after 40 years, when the people who went out of Mitzrayim themselves already died, that their children should also still have this immersion, this involvement in eating blood. Especially after being told by the Eibishter numerous times not to eat it. In other words, not only in question Beis are we asking about the fact that there was Azharis against it, in question Gimel we're asking, the Shtufim B'dam was the previous generation. This is a new generation. Why would we think that this would pass on to the next generation? In Order 20, he points out that a lot of the times, the character traits of a father, of a parent, gets passed down to the children. But he explains that's more about character, not about appetite, not about food tendencies. It's because the father likes certain foods doesn't mean the kids are going to like it. So to say that the fathers were shtufim b'dam because after they saw Mitzrayim, okay. But why would we think that this would be passed down to their children? Therefore, because of these three questions, Rashi brings the second pirush of Ben Azai. Not to say that they were then shtufim bedam, because we just said it's very hard to say that the Yidden were still shtufim bedam 40 years later. So then in that case, why does it say chazak? The pasuk is coming to warn you and to tell you, to teach you how careful you have to be when it comes to mitzvahs. Even though it's easy to be careful from blood because a person doesn't desire it, nevertheless the pasuk has to say chazak, because to strengthen you with regards to this prohibition. How much more so when it comes to other mitzvahs, that even though they are a little more difficult to fulfill, nevertheless we should strengthen ourselves and fulfill them properly. So we mentioned this question actually twice in two different ways. In the question Gimel, we asked why Rashi says She'ein Adam Misav Eloi and not She'ein Adam Shatuf Boi, which is similar to the terminology that Rashi used in the first half of Rashi. And then in question Gimel and Ois Beis, when we were talking about the differences between Rashi and the Sifri, we said that Rashi adds the word She'ein Adam Misav Eloi. So we have to explain these extra words of Rashi in the words of Ben Azai. And he explains it in two ways. Question Aleph is B'chlal, why does Rashi add these words? It says like this: Mikivan shezeh shekal lisham mimenu ulefi she'ein adam misav eloi. Hainu shezeh davar shebeteva adam. Since the reason why blood is easy to refrain from it is because a person doesn't naturally desire it, which means it's something that's built into the human nature. It's understood that this was applicable in the time that this commandment was given. In other words, the fact that Ein Adam Misav Eloi is applicable even in that time of the end of the 40 years, like it would always be applicable because it's something natural. Naturally, a human being does not desire to eat blood. So Rashi's adding in the word She'ein Adam Misav Eloi, not She'ein Adam Shatuf Boi, which is more of an individual tendency, but She'ein Adam Misav Eloi, which is talking general about the human nature, is to tell us that this was something that was applicable during that time when this tzivui was being given. But we also asked the question, why does Rashi say Ein Adam Misav Eloi and not Nafshe Shel Adam Katza Mimenu? So that he's going to answer in point base. The Rashi specifically says She'ein Adam Misav Eloi and doesn't say that a person is katsa mimenu, that a person is revolted by blood. So the reason that Rashi says that the person doesn't have a taiva to it is so a person should not say that the reason why it's kal hishamer, it's easy, is because a person is disgusted by it. Even though this is not opposite, contrary to the approach that they were shtufim b'dam. In other words, even though the two could be consistent, mikol mokim, nevertheless, Rashi does not want to say over here, nafshe shel adam katza mimenu, because the gap between these two opinions would be even greater. If one said that they were shtufim b'dam, that they were immersed in blood, the other says a person doesn't have a desire for it. If the other approach was that the person is revolted by it, that's much further away from people being immersed in it. And therefore, the pasuk says, therefore Rashi says that Nafshe Shel Adam, Ein Adam Misav Eloi, in order to bring the gaps, to make the gap smaller between the two of them. But more importantly, it's the opposite of what we see with our own eyes. Something that a person doesn't have a desire for, and was told stay away from it, is easy to stay away from it. So we don't need to rely on that a person is revolted by it. Even if we were to say simply that a person doesn't desire it, it's enough to keep a person away from it, especially if there was a number of commandments against it. And therefore, If Rashi would say nafshesh ladam katzim mimenu, it would imply that something that I have a taiva towards, that I don't have a taiva towards, is not enough lihishamim mimenu. And that's not true. Rashi wants to say that anything that I don't have a taiva to is easy to stay away from. And therefore Rashi says dafka the words kali nafshesh ladam misadaloi, and not nafshesh ladam katzim mimenu, to tell me that something that a person doesn't have a taiva to, even if, especially if there is a number of commandments against it, is easy to stay away from, even if I'm not revolted by it. So that explains why Rashi brings the second pirush, because he had three questions on the first pirush that it didn't really follow logically. The Yidden were still shtufim b'dam, and therefore Rashi says the second pirush, the taka, they weren't shtufim b'dam, and the reason why the Torah brings, why Rashi brings the second pirush is, and the reason why the Torah says chazak is in order to teach us from here, which is an easy mitzvah, to other mitzvahs, the importance of strengthening ourselves. So in that case, why don't we only bring the second pirush? Omnam, in Ois Dalad, he explains that the second pirush by itself is also not good enough. Rashi does not suffice with this second pirush itself. Rashi brings it as the second explanation also in the quality of the pirush, saying that it's a secondary explanation. At the end of the day, if the Torah wanted to just teach us to strengthen ourselves with regards to other mitzvahs, it could have said chazak by many mitzvahs. The fact that the Torah chooses to say chazak specifically by blood implies it's more sensible to say that blood itself also needs strengthening, and that's why the Torah says chazak specifically by dam. Umashma kain, and it also flows this way better in the general context of the parsha. The parsha Zubal Hatir B'Sar Taiva. Shayu Asurim By Adata. In this parsha, it's original in the beginning of this section. It's coming to permit B'Sar Taiva. B'Sar Taiva means a meat that is being eaten not as part of the carbon. Until this point, if a person wanted to eat meat, he would bring a carbon. And the carbon, part of it would go to the mizbeach, and part of it would go to the kohen, and part of it would go to the bailim, to the person who brought the carbon. Here it's saying, here the parsha, the pasuk introduces that a person could eat b'sar taiva, blood, a meat, just for the sake of, because he has a desire to it. If your soul will desire to eat meat, and all of your desires you can eat meat. The reason he's quoting these psukim over here is because he's referring to the word taiva, avas, and avas again, referring to the idea of taiva, that we're trying to introduce, the pasuk is speaking about eating basar simply for the taiva of it, for the enjoyment of it. So therefore, when the pasuk continues, however, be strong to not eat the blood, it's mashma that you're going to have a taiva, a desire, and an appetite also for the blood. And therefore it's mashma that if it says chazak, it implies they were immersed in eating blood, just like they had a taiva for basar, they had a taiva for dam. But according to Reb Shimon ben Azai, that a person does not have a natural desire to eat, a natural appetite to eat blood, which is coming to teach you about something else entirely. The style of this prohibition. But, however, in other words, despite what we said till now, still you should be careful. Do not eat blood. It doesn't flow from the previous psukim to now. And according to Reb Shimon ben Azai. And maybe Rashi das Rabbi Yehuda l'rishon b'mayla, and therefore he brings Rabbi Yehuda first, implying that this is the more important one of the two pirushim, because that's how the flow sounds, the general context of the psukim flow better that way. In the psukim, this is important. There is how it flows in the words of the pasuk, and the question is coming from the content, the general, from the idea. So in Pshutei Shel Mikra, the idea that the Yidden did have a taiva for blood makes more sense. Even though in the chronologically, historically, according to the times, it seems to say it's 40 years later, why are they still eating blood? Is taka a good question. But in the psukim, there is a mashmos that they still do have a desire for blood, because it's placing it in the context of things that we're eating because they are desirable, and therefore Rashi puts this pirush first because it flows better in the context of the psukim in Pshutei Shel Mikra. So this has answered most of our questions. We explained what were the two questions in the different pirushim. On the first pirush, we had a question that it didn't follow, that it didn't really make sense, that the Yidden were still shtufim bedam. On the second pirush, we had a question that there's mashmos from the psukim is that the people do have a taiva to blood. We answered the question of machlokes b'mitzias, and we said that it's possible to be shatuf, to be immersed in eating something and still not desire it. We answered why Rashi says she'ein on the mis'avaloi. Number one, because he wants to say that it's a natural thing and therefore was applicable at that time. Number two, he wanted to negate the fact that only if you say that something revolts you, is it easy to keep. Even if it doesn't revolt you, you just don't have a desire for it, it's also easy to keep. Which that also explains question Dalid, where he said, why does over here he say different than the later ways of not Adam Katsa Midam? Over there he wants to bring out the Schar. So in the Schar he wants to show how, it doesn't say clearly in the Sikha, but this is I think obvious. When we talk about the Matan Schar, and he wants to go to the furthest extreme. When it comes to telling us the chizuk in the mitzvah, he wants to focus to say that it's easy to be mischazik in it, even if you're not katzamizah, even if you're not disgusted by it, it's still easy to strengthen yourself in it. And therefore he uses dafka those words. Question hey, we didn't answer yet, the Bali HaMaimer. Also in the differences between Rashi and the Sifri, we explained why Rashi doesn't say Kedem Matan Torah, because that would imply that after Matan Torah they were not shtufim bedam. And Rashi holds clearly from the fact that it says chazak here, they were still shtufim bedam. The second question was, why is Rashi maidich? And the answer is because that's how Rashi knows that they were still shtufim bedam, because from the fact that it says chazak over here, so Rashi has to explain how he knows that they were still shtufim bedam. And the question is, why does Rashi say she'ein on the mis'avalei? We just explained that because he wants to bring out these two nukudas: A, that it was natural, and B, that even if it's just something that you don't desire, still it is easy, it is kal lihishamer. We still have to understand, we still have to explain what was in question hey, and will now be in ois hey. Why does Rashi mention Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon ben Azai? A seasoned student can still comment and say, why does each opinion say what they say and argue on what their opponent says? Very interesting phraseology here. Duchka. Each pirush has a question on it that the other one doesn't have. Well, why is one hardship better than the other hardship, or stronger than the other hardship? Why that causes Rabbi Yehuda to go this way and Shimon has to go this way? Mainly Rashi says both, because this one wasn't enough and this one wasn't enough, and he says both. But each of these opinions, why do they say their pirush and not say like the other one? L'chein maybe Rashi shmoi shel Bal HaMaimer, and therefore Rashi brings the name of the person who said it. Because each, Rabbi Yehuda and Ben Azai, in their pirush here about blood, is following their general approach on this topic. And we're going to introduce two new concepts. One is the approach of Rabbi Yehuda, one is the approach of Shimon ben Azai. The Rabbi Yehuda matzinu b'mashakasav le'seichal kol nevela lageir asher b'sherecha titnena v'achala ei moche lenachri. So this is the din of a nevela. A nevela is a kosher animal that was killed not through shchita. So the pasuk says you should give it to the ger. Ger over here means a ger taishav, meaning to say someone who is from the other nations but is living amongst the Yidden in Eretz Yisrael and following the Sheva Mitzvahs. And so it says you should give it to the ger asher b'sharecha, or sell it to a guy. So the Gemara has a discussion: are these examples that you could either give it or sell it to a ger, or give it or sell it to a guy, or are these specific that to a ger you can give it and to a guy you can sell it? So Rabbi Yehuda Svirale Dvarim Kiksavam. You follow the literal interpretation of the words. Leger ben nesina ulenachim mechira. If you're giving it to a ger, you can give it, but you can't sell it. And to a guy, you could sell it and you can't give it. And Rabbi Yehuda argues with Rabbi Meir, who holds that it was just examples, and you could both give it or sell it to both the ger and or the guy. So Rabbi Yehuda's shita is Dvarim Kiksavam. That when you look at a pasuk, you follow the literal understanding of the words. And therefore he applies that approach to our case of the blood. So yes, the mitzvahs, which we could have explained that we were coming about other mitzvahs. We can see it two ways: either that we're referring to other mitzvahs, or that we're referring to the blood itself. Rabbi Yehuda teaches it literally, that it's coming with regards to the blood itself. And it says chazak by the blood, because they needed chizuk, they needed strengthening, encouragement with regards to the blood itself, because they were immersed in it. And even though there's a deichik to say that they were shtufim b'dam, and therefore Rashi actually expresses it in this long-winded way, because Rashi is trying to prove to you that he actually believes that they were shtufim b'dam, but nevertheless, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says Dvarim Kiksavam, he says if it says chazak by dam, it means that by dam they need chizuk. So that's why Rabbi Yehuda follows this approach that they were shtufim b'dam, because his shita is Dvarim Kiksavam, that you follow the literal understanding of the pasuk. Shita Shimon ben Azai. What is Shimon ben Azai shita? Matzina, we find two details. Aleph, lezareis ulechazek b'kiyum hamitzvos afilu hakalos. That B'chlal, that Shimon ben Azai was into encouraging and strengthening the fulfillment of mitzvahs, even those that are easy. U'ka'amre, like he says in Pirkei Avos, haviratz l'mitzvah kala, run to an easy mitzvah. Shapirushay, which means by this. In other words, you could think that it means that you should run to a mitzvah kala and not to a chamura. But even if you don't add in the word kila chamura, like the Alter Rebbe doesn't have the word kila chamura, that you're supposed to run to an easy mitzvah like you would run to a more stringent mitzvah, still does not mean rak le mitzvah kala. The Ben Azai is saying you should only run to an easy mitzvah. Ela gam le mitzvah kala. Also to a mitzvah kala. Mitzvah. As he explains that the reason why you should run to a mitzvah is because mitzvah geredes mitzvah. Also with regards to the opposite, that you're supposed to run away from the aveda, it also means you should run away even if it's a small aveda. Also for that the reason is given, because the aveda leads to another aveda. So Reb Shimon ben Azai holds that a person should run even to an easy mitzvah. So we see from here that Reb Shimon ben Azai was trying to encourage people that even when the mitzvah is easy, you still should be encouraged to fulfill it. Beis, kiyum mitzvah kala, mevi lekiyum shara mitzvahs. Not only is a mitzvah kala important, but the fulfillment of a mitzvah kala actually leads to the fulfillment of other mitzvahs, gam chamuras yaiser, to stringent mitzvahs. And the same thing conversely when it comes to an Aveda, that the running away from a little Aveda keeps you away from doing bigger Avedas, because if you do a little Aveda, you're going to end up coming to doing big Avedas. So by staying away from the little Aveda, it actually helps you stay away from bigger Avedas. So there's two nukudas here. Number one, B'chlal, he was being mechazik people to fulfill. He was focusing on the little mitzvah or the little aveda and say, do the little mitzvah, don't do the little aveda. Number two, Reb Shimon Azai feels or teaches that the little mitzvah leads to the big mitzvah, and refraining from the little aveda leads to refraining from big avedas. And therefore, and this is the shita that he follows here with regards to blood. In both of these details. Aleph. Gam betzivu yishu kali shama mimenu. So the chli is chazak ba'azarasei. Shebe mitzvah sasei u'masha amar ratz le-mitzvah gam kala. U'belei sasei b'chal aveda. Bereach min aveda. Even with regards to blood, which is easy to refrain from it. Nevertheless, it has to say chazak, because B'Shimon ben Azai holds that you have to be strengthened even for easy mitzvahs. And this is in both ways. When it comes to a mitzvah sasei, he says run to a mitzvah, even a small mitzvah. And Malaysia says, he says, run away from the Aveda. In other words, that even though it's an easy mitzvah, nevertheless, you have to be chazak, you have to running away implies extra investment in doing it or not doing it, what you're not supposed to do. Beis, not only are we saying chazak with regards to blood, but la'ashircho, l'lamdachad, kama tatzarech l'schazak b'mitzvahs, kavachem l'shar mitzvahs. We're learning from blood to the other mitzvahs. What it's saying here is not just telling me that I have to be chazak with regards to blood, even though it's a mitzvah kala, but we have to learn from this to the other mitzvahs. Dugmas omrei aviratz l'mitzvah kala shemitzvah gereretz mitzvah. Similar to what he says, that you have to run to an easy mitzvah, because that will bring you to another mitzvah. Utekayim gam shar mitzvahs, it will bring you to fulfill other mitzvahs. Ubereach min ha'aveda v'adezat yirachah gam min shar avedas, you should run away from other avedas, because you should run away from an easy aveda, because that will bring you to run away from other avedas. So he's saying the same thing by the blood, that by being chazak with regards to blood, this helps you to be chazak, but to be strong by other avedas, other mitzvahs and avedas as well. So now, even though in a certain sense, these two inyanim are not related to each other, but at least we see that Rabbi Yehuda is following his shita with the way he understands this pasuk, because his shita is dvarim kiksavam, and Rabbi Shimon ben Azai is following his shita, which was the encouragement and the importance of strengthening even a small mitzvah. A, because small mitzvahs need chizuk, and two, because small mitzvahs lead to big mitzvahs. So too over here, he believes that even though it's a small thing, it's kali yishamer, nevertheless it has to say chazak, and also that we could learn from here for other mitzvahs. Beautiful. We're not done yet. Because since seemingly dvarim kiksavam and chizuk of mitzvahs are not mutually exclusive, we have to still understand, why do they have to argue by dam? Why can't Rabbi Yehuda also believe that here we're coming to be mechazik things? He could hold that we're shtufim b'dam, but he could also hold that it was coming to be mechazik things. And why can't Rabbi Shimon ben Azai say dvarim kiksavim as well, that they were shtufim b'dam, and they still need chizuk in mitzvahs? In other words, if Rabbi Shimon ben Azai does not hold dvarim kiksavim specifically, then they have to argue. But since the lishitases that we're bringing here are not related to each other, seemingly, why do we have to turn this into an argument? That's his question in Aizvav. Vini alpi Amar Yadin and the Shittas Rabbi Yudi the Dvarim Kiksavam. Shittas Rabbi Shimon ben Azai lo rotzafidu l'mitzvah kala v'afacha ba'aveda. So now we know that Rabbi Yehuda's shita is, Rabbi Yehuda's approach is that you follow the words as they're written. And the shita of Shimon ben Azai is to encourage, to run, to do even a mitzvah, an easy mitzvah, and to run away from an aveda. Aval minalon Rabbi Yehuda leisvil Rabbi Shimon ben Azai tzarich li is chazak b'mitzvah shekal l'shemra. Rabbi Shimon ben Azai leisvil Rabbi Yehuda devarim kiksavam. How do we know that Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, Rabbi Yehuda does not hold that you have to be strong in an easy mitzvah, and that Rabbi Shimon ben Azai does not hold devarim kiksavam? Why are we making this into an exclusive argument? Va'abir. And in order to explain this, we're going to bring two machloikesim between Reb Shimon ben Azai and Rabbi Yehuda, where we're going to see that it's more of a consistent approach on both sides, that therefore when it comes here, they are each following their unique approach and their exclusive approach. There is a Gemara in the end of Brachas. Tanya ben Azai, Eimer ben Azai taught, Pamachas nechnasti achar Rabbi Akiva lebeis hakisei, v'lemadati mimenu gimel dvarim, lemadati chulu. I once followed Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was his Rebbe. Rabbi Akiva was the teacher of Ben Azai. So Ben Azai says, I once followed Rabbi Akiva into the beis hakisei, into the bathroom. And I learned three things. He doesn't enumerate them here in the Sikha, but obviously the Gemara in Brachas does. But of course we know that in Shulchan Aruch there's a siman called Anhagas beis hakisei, which means that halacha teaches us how to conduct ourselves in a bathroom. And therefore, Ben Azai went to learn these halachas. Rabbi Yehuda says to him, has your insolence, has your audacity gone this far to go with your Rebbe into a beis hakisei? So he responded to him, it's Torah and I have to learn it. In other words, it doesn't matter how. It's a chelek of Torah. It's a chelek of Torah. It's a part of Torah to know how one is to conduct themselves in a beis hakisei. And therefore, I have to learn it, and I have to go in. I have no choice. What's their disagreement? Why is Rabbi Yehuda so upset that Ben Azai would be so disrespectful to go into a beis hakisei, and Ben Azai has no issues with it? It's a part of learning. Even though it's Torah and it has to be learned, in any learning, how do you learn? You ask the halacha. In Beis Medrash, you go to the Rav, you go to the Rebbe, you go to the Rosh Hashiva, you ask, what's the halacha? That's why Reb Shimon ben Azai, that's why he says to him, why did you have to go into the Beis hakisei, which is disrespectful, instead of asking the question in the Beis Medrash? In other words, since Rabbi Yehuda is a very literal guy, dvarim kiksavam, so therefore he says, you have a question, ask. Reb Shimon ben Azai, whose life was running even to a small mitzvah, there was a certain ambitiousness when it comes to doing a mitzvah. The same thing when it comes to clarifying halacha. There was a certain sense of ambitiousness. If there's a better way than asking the question in Beis Medrash, let's do the best possible way. If you have no choice, you ask. But if you have a better choice, you might as well go watch it being done, because the teaching, the Maisa is a way of learning. The Alderech, Maimer Chazal, similar to Maimer Chazal, that you can't learn a halacha, not from something that was discussed in Beis Medrash, because over there they're discussing svaras, but they may not have reached that conclusion. So you can't take a svara that was learned in the Beis Medrash and paskin halacha from it. Nor can you paskin halacha from a maisa. It's possible that you saw a story and you might not know the details of the story. So you might say, okay, in that specific case, that was the halacha, but it's not the halacha always. The Gemara over there in Shabbos says that you shouldn't learn from a svara in yeshiva. You shouldn't learn from something from a story that you heard, but you should learn halacha l'maisa. Now, really, this is almost at ayah le'epech. That's what he says, va'al derech. What you see from here is that you go as far as you can in order to verify what the halacha is. So just because you heard a svara like this, just because you even saw someone do something in a certain way, doesn't necessarily mean that that's the halacha. But from here we see that when it comes to bidur halacha, we go as far as possible. Says Ben Azai, if I can go and see how it's being done, that would be the best way for me to learn the halacha. And therefore he follows Rabbi Akiva into the Beis HaKisei in order to see how he conducts himself in actuality, because that's the best way to learn. You learn by example. And over here you see a shtickle, you see a little bit how they're being consistent with Dvarim Kiksavam. It's words, it's the facts, it's as it is, it's how it is, you do it as you do it. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says, ask and you'll be answered. Rabbi Shimon ben Azai is always looking for deeper, for more. He's running. And therefore, he goes to the furthest degree to learn the halacha. This will also answer the question of the Marsha. The Marsha in Chidush HaGados asks them, who forced him to be disrespectful in this manner? He could have just gone and asked his Rebbe how he's supposed to conduct himself. So the Marsha has an interesting answer. He doesn't know what to ask. He didn't know what is he supposed to ask. What is it? What could be wrong in a bathroom that I have to ask if it's okay or not? Therefore, it says it's Teid. I have to learn. I have to know what to ask about. So the Marsha is answering that the reason he couldn't go to his Rebbe and ask him directly is because he didn't know what to ask. In other words, the Gemara there, what he learns is in which direction you're supposed to sit, for example. So he wouldn't have even known to ask, is there a specific direction or not? But so that's the Marsha's answer. But Lezachisi Lavin, an interesting terminology, the Rabbi says, Lezachisi Lavin. He doesn't know He could have asked that. He could have gone to his Rabbi and said, I don't know what to ask you, but I want to know, is there anything that I have to know with regards to a Beis HaKisei? But now this question of the Marsha is answered and differently. She tosei v'darkish of Shimon ben Azai. Last is called Dovar v'inyimitei mitzvahs be'efin shalitz v'schazkes yeseda. It wasn't just about the bathroom that he didn't know which halachas to ask about. His approach in life in general was that he did, when it came to Torah mitzvahs, he did it with ambition. He did it with aggressiveness, a good aggressiveness. He did it with always trying to do more and more. And since there's no clearer halacha than than following by example, of course he could have gone to his Rebbe and asked, is there anything I need to know? But he wouldn't have learned it as good. He actually goes in with him to the Beis HaKisei to learn from him by seeing his conduct in reality, in actuality, because this is the best teacher. This is the best way to learn. And Ben Azai is not about Dvarim Kiksavam. He's not satisfied just with seeing it as it is in writing. He wants to go deeper. He wants to learn more. He wants to learn it as good as he can. And therefore, even though he's risking his respect for his Rebbe, he goes all the way in to learn the halacha. Mashenkin shitase shel Rabbi Yehuda is so she'ein tzarich la'aretz ad kedei la'is panav v'chol. Rabbi Yehuda's shit is you don't have to run all to the point that you're being disrespectful. V'av she'teirehi v'chulu, and even though it's teireh and you have to know the halachas, that it's sufficient to ask his Rebbe if there are relevant halachas to the Beis HaKisei. However, and therefore the way Rabbi Azai conducted himself, according to Rabbi Yehuda, was considered insolence, chutzpah, hazaspanim. Because according to him, it's perfectly fine to ask and be answered. We find another machlokes between Rabbi Ben Azai and Rabbi Yehuda, where again you see them following this, each their own respective approach. Ben Azai Omer, Nemar Mechashefa Leisachaya, Nemar Kol Shechev Mehema Meisumas. There's two psukim next to each other, where one says Mechashefa Leisachaya that you have to kill a person engaged in sorcery, and then another one it says Kol Shechev Mehema Meisumas, that someone who lies with a behema also gets the death penalty. Samchu inyan loy. From the juxtaposition of these two things, even though they're unrelated, machashefa and shechev and behema is two different things. The fact that they're next to each other, ma shechev and behema beskila, af machashefa beskila. The pasuk doesn't say which misa is given to a machashefa, to a sorcerer, but since Kol Shechev and Behema gets skila, therefore we learn, and Shechev and Behema is juxtaposed to Mechashefa Leisachaya. Therefore, from this we derive that also Mechashefa gets skila. Amalei Rabbi Yehuda says to Ben Azai, just because the two things are juxtaposed, because of that I'm going to take this person for skila. Ella, I'll give you a different answer. Oy v'yadaini is two different types of sorcery, and they were in, and it says by them, and they were excluded, so to speak, to apply the misa of the punishment of skila. Now we all know, or many of us know, it says, we say it every day in davening, kol doros oy b'chlal, v'yotza min haklal alamed, leil alamed alatzmi yotza, el alamed haklal kula yotza. Anything that was in the general rule, in the general group, and then was extracted from the group, did not just come to teach about itself, but came to teach about the whole group. So once Oy v'Yedaini were removed from the group to be said separately, that they are beskila. From this we learn that all type of kishiv is all beskila. Oy v'Yedaini were included in sorcery. But why were they excluded? To compare to them and teach you that just like Oy v'Yedaini is beskila, because that the pasuk says explicitly, so too mechashefa is also with skila. What's the reasoning behind the machlekes? Ben Azai learns from the juxtaposition. If two things are next to each other, you can compare them. The fact that the general parsha is next to this general parsha is enough to learn the punishment which is skila. Rabbi Yehuda wonders, just because they're next to each other, this is enough to give the person skila. The fact that Oy v'Yedaini were taken out of the klal is to teach you specifically that all kishif, all sorcerers, including mechashefa beskila, basically mikra mefurish, it's a clear pasuk. So Rabbi Yehuda doesn't want a juxtaposition. He doesn't want a limud of smuchim. He wants something dvarim kiksavam. He wants something written explicitly or close to explicitly in order to derive which misa you would give to the mechashefa. So again, we see that Ben Azai is ready to go into deeper layers in order to determine what the halacha is, even taking two separate things that have no connection to each other than their position in the Torah, and learn from one another. Masha'ein kain, Rabbi Yehuda Dafkin needs something clearly from the pasuk, and smuchin is not enough. Well, if we go now back to Dam, Rabbi Yehuda is dvarim kiksavam, and therefore has to say that Chazak is referring to Dam, that Dam needs chizuk, because he doesn't want to say that he doesn't want to. He doesn't have this approach of Ben Azai that you could take things a step further even without clear understanding. So from the pasuk, Ben Azai says, "I'm going to go as far as I need to, in order to determine, to learn, to understand." Rabbi Yehuda says, "No, you can't do that. Dvarim kiksavam." And therefore, if the pasuk says by dam chazak, then it has to be applicable to dam, to nothing else. But Azai was ready to go to further steps, so much so that he's ready to be Deir Smuchim, so much so that he's ready to go into the Beis HaKisei with Rabbi Akiva, his Rebbe, in order to learn Torah. He also would learn chazak as far as it can go, that it should be applicable to as much as possible and not leave it exclusively to dam, because he wants to take the Torah as far as it can possibly go. So now, besides knowing that Ben Azai holds Dvarim Kiksavam from the union of Nevela, and Ben Azai Rabbi Yehuda holds Dvarim Kiksavam from the union of Nevela, and Ben Azai holds the union of Ritza Mitzvah Kala, which we apply to here, we have now determined that this Ritza Mitzvah Kala is a general approach in Rabbi Yehuda and Ben Azai's learning style, and therefore, if there's a pasuk that says Rak Chazak Levilti Acher Adam, but I could apply it to many other mitzvahs, I would, because that's his style in learning, to take something as far as it could possibly go. And Rabbi Yehuda Dvarim Kiksavim holds it explicitly and exclusively Dvarim Kiksavim, and I'm dafkin not going to expand it to other mitzvahs unless the Torah specifically tells me to do so, which it doesn't do in the case of dam, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda holds that it's specifically talking about dam. And this answers the final question, why Rashi has to mention Ben Azai by the name and Rabbi Yehuda by the name, because of the deeper insight that it gives us into understanding the Lishitase of each of them and how they reach this understanding in regards to the mitzvah of not eating dam. Now we go to the Chassidus, to the lesson and to the deeper understanding of this Rashi. Why is it usher to eat blood? Says the pasuk, because the blood is the soul, or the life source. The Mefarshim explain, even though the life source exists also in the flesh of the animal, there's a difference between the flesh in which the life source exists, to the blood, which is the source of life itself. The blood is the life source of the animal, and therefore we cannot eat the life source of the animal. So now he explains, what does it mean that the blood is the life source and therefore we can't eat it? From anything that a person eats, it becomes part of his flesh and blood. And therefore a person inculcates within themselves the nature of the things they eat. The Rebbe brings in the Order 44 that the Ramban says that one of the reasons why we're not supposed to eat predatory animals is because if we eat predatory animals, chas v'shalom, we inject into ourselves a predatory nature. So that because the food is becoming part of us, so whatever was the nature of the food before it became food becomes part of us. So if a person eats meat, kosher meat, number one, because it only has the nefesh in it, but it's not the nefesh itself. So it doesn't have the strength of the nefesh and therefore of the teva of the behema. Beis, in other words, he brings the Ramban about not kosher animals, but the same thing applies to kosher animals as well. That a person who eats meat is going to, the flesh of an animal, is going to gain some behema, some animalistic tendencies. However, if you're eating basar, so number one, the natural tendencies are not so strong in the basar. Beis, habasar tzarich li is nilas umisakel umishtana v'chulu. The food is chewed and digested, and then it becomes changed. That's an asadamu basar. V'shavel tevanis, and it becomes flesh and blood, and becomes part of the nature of the person being sustained. And therefore it doesn't affect the person as much. But blood that does not need to be digested, like the meat. If a person eats blood, which is the life force of the animal, then this will fuse together, this will connect the nature of the behemoth with the nefesh of the person will gain, will become connected to the animalistic tendencies and the animalistic nature of the behemoth, and it will become vergrept. It will become vergrept, they say coarse. It will become animalistic, like the soul, like the life of a behemoth. So a person who eats meat, number one, the meat doesn't have as much, the flesh doesn't have as much of the nature or the tendencies of the behemoth. Number two, you're chewing it up, you're swallowing it, it's becoming a new entity. But when a person, chas v'shalom, eats blood, then he's injecting himself with the very life source of this animal, and therefore is injecting himself with these animalistic tendencies. So it's understood that those who are immersed in eating blood, midos, the nefesh of ba'am shalem, their animalistic, the midos of their animal soul is just like the animalistic nature of a behemoth. So what is a person to do? A person who feels that they have animalistic natures or animalistic tendencies, what do you do? So Rashi says two levels. First, Rashi talks to those who were immersed in eating blood. Therefore, the pasuk says, "Rak chazak, which is that a person has to strengthen themselves to rectify and to fix and to cleanse his natural character traits of his nefesh habamis, to improve them, to refine them." And this Piddush comes from Rabbi Yehuda. The name Yehuda was named because this time I will thank Hashem. Thanking Hashem comes from the acknowledgement. From the acknowledgement in Hashem's existence and what He gave us. Ubitul, and a humility and a thankfulness to Hashem. Umitzad zeh ha'avedi bebitul ubidur madreges achitachtenis evedis eskafia. And when you're coming from the point of humility, from the point of heidah, on this level you are working with the lowest levels. Your askafia, which is subduing the evil, you haven't yet transformed yourself. You're still fighting the negativity, and you do so with bittul. He still has access. He still has connection to his natural midas of his nefesh habamis. He has to refine them and change them. So the first stage in Rashi says comes Rabbi Yehuda. Yehuda comes from the state of the level of bittul, which is the beginning of the Aveda, the foundation of the Aveda. He says, Rak chazak, strengthen yourself to refine your midas hativiyim, to refine your nefesh habamis, your animal soul, to get rid or to transform somehow, and to refine your animalistic tendencies. That's level one. Reb Shimon ben Azai lived a different kind of life. His Aveda was in the yearning, in the longing for holiness. His goal and his desire was to go up higher and higher. Like we see with regards to Ezek HaTorah. It says that Shimon ben Azai was not married. He said, what should I do that my soul desires, is engrossed in the desire of Torah? He didn't have time, or he didn't want to invest in the what it takes to be married because he was too engrossed in learning Torah. It's not necessarily a something that is meant to be emulated, but it at least shows what kind of person Ben Azai was. Ben Azai was removed from this physical world, so much so that he didn't even get married. and his whole desire and goal and life purpose was to go higher and higher in learning Torah and getting closer to Hashem. And therefore all aspects of his learning Torah and doing mitzvahs was in this ambitious, running, strengthening kind of way. According to him, so according to him, the pasuk wouldn't be talking about stam refining your animalistic character traits. He's way beyond that. The pasuk is not talking here about refining and transforming a person's natural character traits, because we're beyond that at this point. But to teach you to be strengthened in mitzvahs. And notice the word la'azircha. La'azircha miloshen zoyar v'er. La'azircha comes from the lashon of light and illumination. That a person should strengthen themselves and to elevate, uplift themselves, to illuminate their soul with the godly light of mitzvahs. If something that is easy to refrain from it, because a person doesn't have a taiva to it, doesn't have a desire to it, nevertheless he wants to strengthen you with this prohibition. They say matters, meaning to say let's refrain this with regards to ba'az harasa, that it means illumination in being, because there's shebelabachin on the misabel mitzvah the nafshe bahamis. So when it comes to something that a person doesn't desire mitzad his midas of his nefesh abamis, because he built himself up, he worked on his midas, on his nefesh abamis. He came to a point that he doesn't desire this. He doesn't. He's separated from it. Nevertheless, we have to strengthen it with its prohibition. But over here, azarasai means when it comes to illuminating himself. It's not enough that I'm not engaged in negative character traits, in animalistic character traits. I have to illuminate my even in these things that once upon a time he did come from the nefesh abamis, but now I lifted myself up a level, and nevertheless the Torah tells us I have to illuminate that with a godly light. So it shouldn't just be that I'm not doing it, I'm not engrossed in it on an animalistic level, but I have to illuminate it on a godly level. How much more so when it comes to other mitzvahs? When it comes to mitzvahs that I still do desire, meaning to say, I still do have a desire to do what I shouldn't do. The way I respond to this is by strengthening myself, by staying away from it, and to just illuminate with a lot of light, in order to be able to overcome these taivas or these tendencies. In other words, there's two ways to deal with something. One is to fight it and to break it and to subdue it. That's the approach of Rabbi Yehuda. Another one is to just pour so much light onto it, so much positive energy, so much Eira Leki that it doesn't even make, it's not even an issue. Like they say about Reb Zalman Zezmer, I think they say that he used to use his gaiva as a way to stop the person stop the Yetzer Hara from telling him, me, I'm the chassid of the Alter Rebbe, how could you try to convince me to do kach v'kach? In other words, there was so much positive energy over there that the negative, the taivas, the nyanim abahamiyim didn't even enter the mind. And these are the two approaches of Rashi. The approach of Rabbi Yehuda, Dvarim Kiksavam, you got to deal with the issues. And the issues is you have to strengthen yourself, to refine your midas, to change your midas, so that you shouldn't have a taiva to these types of things. Then you have the approach of Reb Shimon ben Azai that sort of ignores the negativity. Even though there's a taiva there, and a person has a taiva for it, how do I deal with it? By shedding a ribui oil, an abundance of godly light onto it, focusing on the positive, doing the positive, and that overpowers the negative character traits and overcomes the taivas, even in those things that a person does have a taiva to sometimes, and to be able to fill the person's life with Eir Eliki and to overcome all of the challenges.